Hey everyone, this is Anna Gressel, and you're listening to the AI Drop, your briefing on how AI is reshaping the future of business law and industry. We bring you fresh drops each week so you never miss a beat. Welcome to the podcast. Okay, everyone, welcome back to the AI Drop. I'm your host, Anna Gressel, and today we're diving deep into the world's most dynamic tech landscape, Asia. Now, from my perspective, I think Asia is actually the most interesting place to talk about tech regulation today, because we have the EU AI Act on one side, which is kind of doing its thing. We're looking at the digital omnibus. We're figuring out where the AI Act is going to land. And on the other hand, we have the US, which is really this interesting patchwork of all different kinds of trends and trend lines, but hyper-localized, hyper-specific. And meanwhile, we have Asia. And I think there are so many interesting jurisdictions there that are each kind of taking their own approach to AI, probably overlays quite a bit with what they're trying to achieve geopolitically. And so I have invited my colleague, Rohit Bhat, to help us decode all of this. And we're so lucky to be joined by Rohit. I want him to kick us off by telling us about himself. Actually, Rohit, you have such an interesting career and history, and I think it informs the way that you approach these things.
Sure. Thanks, Anna. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. So my name is Rohit Bhat. I'm a partner at Freshfields based in Singapore. I'm a disputes partner. You mentioned, Anna, that I have quite a diverse background. And, sometimes I wake up in the morning and think, am I an investigation lawyer? Am I an arbitration lawyer? I do both of those things. So just stepping back, I started my career as a litigator in India, spent about 6 or 7 years there, and then moved to doing international disputes with Freshfields. Now, quite a long time ago, it's been about 7 years. And my practice is a mix of both arbitration work, but also investigations, both internal and regulatory investigations oversight. During my time at Freshfields back in 2023, I spent about 18 months in-house on secondment to Google. And that's where my interest in AI really kickstarted, because it was the early phase of tech regulation in Asia, which I had the opportunity to handle a little bit. So since then, I have focused a little bit on tech regulation, keeping track of everything that's going on in Asia. And like you said, it's a patchwork, and would be keen to speak to you about that.
It's interesting that you've been doing this for 7 years. And I started my practice back in 2018. So it's a similar time horizon. There's so much that's happened in tech regulation in exactly that period of time. And so I'd love to talk a little bit about where did this all come from? When I think back to a few years ago, we basically said there's the EU, the US, and China's doing its own thing. But since then, we've seen just this explosion of interest in regulating AI across jurisdictions. So before we get into the specifics, how have you seen those trend lines evolve?
Yeah, sure. So let me focus on Asia here a little bit, right? Because in Asia, historically, when it comes to other technology, there was a sense, I think, that regulators in Asia were following what's happening in the EU and the US. And as Asia has grown, and Asia is quite a diverse jurisdiction, countries in Asia are now wanting to be the leader and not be the follower anymore. And we are seeing that in the kind of legislations that are coming out. We're seeing that in, for example, Korea, in India. And it's true of other regulators, not just AI specific, but for example, antitrust regulators as well, right? So historically, maybe there was a sense that Asia was following what's going on in the EU and the US, but now that has changed. And I think with AI, it is transformational, and jurisdictions in Asia are taking note and wanting to ensure that this technology is used for the greater good of their respective societies. So jurisdictions are looking at it as a public infrastructure tool to kickstart various projects that they have. So it's interesting to see that, and they are taking the lead on regulating AI.
Well, I'd love to start by taking a bit of a deeper dive into one of what seems like the most dramatic pivots, which is from India. I mean, a few years ago, if you asked what's happening with AI regulation in India, it might be nothing that we had heard about. And now all of a sudden, when you talk to tech groups within or legal groups within tech companies, or more broadly, even within financial services, everyone is looking at India right now. I don't think there's a way of understating that. And I know you're super close. We obviously don't have an office in India, but we're super close to kind of watching the trends. Just take us through what happened and what is going on. What's the state of play right now?
Yeah. So I think to your point about everyone's watching India, I think there's obviously good reason for that. India is now the largest country in the world by population, 1.4 billion people, right? It's a country that's developed significantly over the years. It's had over 6-7% growth year on year. And so there's a lot of opportunity in India. There's a lot of business opportunity in India. And we are seeing that across different sectors, private capital, tech. From a pure user standpoint, it's one of the largest markets for companies like Google and Meta. We're seeing Apple expand its presence in India. We're seeing increased manufacturing. So India is important. From an AI perspective, it is important because it's got scale. It is a testing ground because there's diversity in use cases. And so you're seeing a lot of companies use the diversity that India presents to test out their AI models and various tools that they have. So I think that is where the importance of India comes in. I think from a government standpoint, Prime Minister Modi sees the benefit of AI and what it can do to the Indian economy. There was the recent AI summit in India, which was attended by the who's who in the world of tech. And Prime Minister Modi gave a huge speech about how AI is going to be used for the public good in India. There are a few parallels that are being drawn to a unified payments mechanism in India, which is government-run payments mechanism, which is interoperable and has been a huge success story. And what the Indian government wants to do is also have AI as one such government-run initiative, which benefits the whole country. So there's a lot of government involvement in promoting AI. But in terms of regulation and coming to regulation, I think until maybe last year, it was just different regulators regulating parts of AI. So you had antitrust regulators come in and do market studies on AI. You had the Ministry of Information Technology issue a few advisories on AI, which includes labeling requirements, for example. But recently, there has been an amendment to the intermediary guidelines in India, the Information Technology Act, which specifically seeks to regulate what they call synthetically generated information. And it includes faster timelines for takedown requests, labeling requirements, user notification requirements. So that is the one law now that specifically seeks to regulate AI, along with patchwork of other laws.
And when I think about this in like the broader scheme of AI regulatory trends, it seems like it is one of the most intense labeling regimes. Tell us more about that law and what is the goal of this regulatory regime?
Yeah, so I think the law does try and balance innovation with a regulation, but at the same time, India has had a history of trying to regulate intermediaries, and intermediaries are obviously defined in different ways. There is general concept of intermediary. There's also a concept of significant social media intermediary, where if there are platforms that satisfy certain user requirements, I think it's 5 million, then you're termed a significant social media intermediary. So what India seems to have done is brought within that law a requirement on intermediaries to comply with AI-specific requirements. So it's interesting because it does target core issues that regulators globally are looking into. So, for example, non-consensual images. And I think that is something that India needed to do, and they have done so. But along with that, they've also brought in, like you said, labeling requirements. There were proposals of very strict labeling requirements, but now the final version of the law seems to have left it to the intermediaries to decide what type of labeling they want to use, so long as they are able to clearly distinguish AI-generated content. So I think that's where they have landed. With respect to takedown rules, it's interesting because takedown requirements always exist in India. What India seems to have done is used the need to regulate AI and define synthetically generated information to also reduce takedown timelines. And takedown timelines depend on whether it's unlawful content or whether it is non-consensual images. So it really depends on the nature of the takedown request. But the problem really is that unlawful content is very broadly defined. So we will have issues around what is unlawful content, whether the government can issue advisories to take down unlawful content, let's say generated by an AI platform, or whether it should be unlawful contents that's more, publicly decimated. So there will be these issues that will come up. As with everything in India, it's a wait and see approach. You'll have to see how the ministry is going to implement these guidelines, given how broad they are. There is lots of room for back and forth. So we'll just have to wait and see that.
I mean, it's completely fascinating. There are so many ways in which this touches on trends that we're seeing in other jurisdictions around non-consensual intimate imagery, CSAM, just again, watermarking and labeling. So it's definitely, I think, one of the jurisdictions for companies to watch. And as we've seen kind of globally, there's been a lot of borrowing. One concept comes up here and then it pops up in other jurisdictions. So we kind of try to watch these trends holistically. I want to talk a little bit about like a completely different topic than content, which is agents.
Yes.
And maybe we can pivot to Singapore, because I will say just like surprised in a super positive way by Singapore's agentic governance framework that they released recently. We had been talking a lot with companies about how to govern agents starting, I mean, for me, I think like probably in late 2024, early 2025, as we were beginning to see these, new agents kind of really be architected within tech companies. And the question was, what do you do from a technical perspective to govern them? What's the new risk surface there? And what should companies be thinking about that's like net different, net new from generative AI? And then Singapore really came out with this framework. And in a way, it's no surprise. I mean, Singapore's always been really forward thinking in terms of kind of voluntary governance frameworks, but it was interesting to see them pick up on this agentic piece really before almost maybe any other regulator. So I'll just turn it to you. Curious for your reactions to that proposal, but also like, what else is happening in Singapore? What's like happening on the ground? And what do you find most interesting about the way that Singapore is approaching tech these days?
Yeah, Singapore I think it's an exciting jurisdiction for AI because like you said, the Singapore government has always been forward-looking. And on AI specifically, I find that there are lots of soft law instruments that have been released to promote safe use of AI while at the same time ensuring that innovation continues. So just stepping back, the agentic AI framework, it's a soft law instrument. It's not a binding obligation on any company operating in Singapore, but it was released in January of 2026. But if you go back about a year, there is a huge conference that takes place in Singapore each year. It's called Super AI. And I was at Super AI in 2025. And interestingly, the theme of the conference, and this was May or June of 2025, the theme of the conference in 2025 was agentic AI. So they've been looking at it since then. The conference was full of companies that were testing AI agents, lots and lots of panels on regulating AI agents in different sectors, what it means for the financial services industry, what it means for the legal industry. So it was a super interesting conference. And I don't know if this is right, but maybe the framework, the agentic AI framework, was just a natural next step coming out of that conference. I do feel like agentic AI agents, it is the future, right? If you look at the history of the past 3 years, I think we first focused on ethics, we then focused on risk. Now we do seem to be focused on enforcement, agents. So the themes have changed. On the agentic AI framework, I think there are, I would say, 4 key pillars to it. The first is you have to assess and bound risks upfront. So it has certain guidelines on suitability, what limitations need to be in place. Interestingly, it says that every AI agent needs to have its own identity, its unique identity number. And then the second is really human in the loop. And that is the core principle behind the agentic AI framework. It also requires technical controls. So sandbox testing in real world situations without it being rolled out to humans, guardrails around what could go wrong. And that really takes you to the 4th pillar, which is end user responsibility. There needs to be a kill switch effectively. And these are, again, guidelines, but it's a start because I think we will see more of this going forward. We will see industry-specific guidelines evolve over a period of time because I do think that AI agents have to be regulated a different way depending on which industry they're in. But this is the first step and it's very interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, the kill switch point is always such an interesting one. I was on a panel recently with a friend of mine who was telling a story about an incident response that they essentially handled in the agentic context. And I will just make a side note here that AI incidents in the agentic context are something for really every company to think about. But apparently this agent there was like an agent gone wild within this company and the user noticed this and just shut her laptop. And like, that was like the response. Like, but it's so human to be like, I'm just going to like, oh shoot, I'm going to close my laptop. I'm like, got to turn it off. Of course, that's not really the right way to do it. A kill switch sounds like this huge thing, but really in some ways like this stop button, just like, basic ways for humans to intervene in systems that are like otherwise a bit automated. It's important to think those through and for many companies, this question on like how to govern agents is going to be one of the most important governance questions. It's like if you haven't had that conversation and you're on an AI governance committee, it's probably time to start. And so, but it's great to see Singapore putting out, like, as always, kind of practical, useful guidance to get people started and to identify some of those core risks for folks who are doing those risk taxonomies within companies and trying to actually problem solve, like, what do we need to be thinking about? So let's talk a little bit. I want to hit on one more jurisdiction. I think we could cover actually a bunch of others. But let's talk a little bit about South Korea and the Basic Act for Regulation of AI, because that just came into force. And that's important too. And just tell us a little bit about these rules. What was the approach from South Korea on how to actually regulate AI in this kind of comprehensive way?
Yeah, so South Korea is an interesting jurisdiction, right? Because there is a lot of focus on promoting local South Korean companies. There's a lot of focus on regulating foreign companies. And we see our clients face a lot of issues in South Korea on regulations all the time across different regulators. I think with Korea, just going back about 3 years, Korea was one of the first jurisdictions to really start asking hard questions about AI and large language models. So I recall the PIPC, which is a privacy commission, asking questions on how large language models are trained, whether personal information is being used in training large language models, what safeguards are in place. So very detailed questions back and forth with certain companies that have the capability to train and develop large language models. And I think Korea very early on started thinking about having an AI-specific statute rather than having different regulators regulate parts of AI. So I think the AI Act in Korea was brought out back in 2025. It was already enacted in 2025, but implemented earlier this year in January 2026, which is now in force. The statute itself differentiates between AI developers and AI operators. Like you said, it does have a little bit of flexibility, but what Korea has done is it's followed the risk-based approach, which we're also now seeing Vietnam follow, which is the other jurisdiction in Asia, which has a hard law instrument. But coming back to Korea, I think the one thing it does is it strictly regulates high-impact AI, which means it regulates issues like biometrics, robotics, healthcare, finance. And these high-impact applications on AI, they require prior disclosure, human in the loop. So it's really important to keep track of whether you fall within the category of high-impact AI use or not in Korea under the statute. So that's one. Like in other jurisdictions, it also has transparency requirements. But interestingly, it also has a localization requirement. And I think that's another thing to keep in mind for foreign multinational players who are investing in Korea or even rolling out their AI products in Korea. So if you satisfy certain criteria, you may need to have a domestic representative in Korea, which is something else we're seeing in Vietnam, for example, right? So that is, I think, how Korea is looking at it. Korea and other jurisdictions in Asia also have now specific AI committees, which could result in AI-specific regulators, a move away from the PIPC or the KFTC into having more AI-specific regulators. So that's Korea.
One of the things I think is, so interesting coming out of Korea these days is also this desire to have and foster national champions on AI and just the investment that's going into that. It reminds me a lot of what we see in the UAE, just like investing into really high promise startups or tech companies that are going to kind of flesh out that tech stack. And so, definitely an interesting jurisdiction to watch as well, just from a kind of a tech development angle. So, let's put back on your investigations arbitration hat. Tell us a little bit about like the enforcement landscape. Is, when you're looking at, I would say, kind of Asia in the aggregate, where do you see kind of the enforcement trend lines going?
Yeah, sure. So on the enforcement side, we've seen some issues come up. So let me speak about two issues. One specifically when handling internal investigations or external regulatory investigations, not just for tech clients, but also any other client, right? We are seeing a huge move towards using e-discovery in the AI and e-discovery. And I think regulators, courts, tribunals are still grappling with what is adequate in terms of how you use AI. Does it satisfy your obligation to conduct a fair and proportionate search of all the documents? And that takes you into really a rabbit hole on how your prompts have been curated, what type of tool you use. So I think that's one issue that we're seeing across different sectors. because there are huge efficiency gains in using AI for document review. We've used it extensively on 2 investigations. On one of them, we had a data set of 3 million documents reduced to 1,500 key documents, and then a different set of 100,000 highly relevant and 200,000 likely relevant. But even the 1,500 key documents had an over 90% hit rate, which is great in terms of how quickly you're able to find the relevant documents, right? But is that going to satisfy a regulator if you have to submit these documents and satisfy the regulator that you conducted a reasonable search for relevant documents? So that is a question that we are seeing. The other issue that often comes up is AI washing, which is very, I think, quite interesting, and we should explore a little bit more. We've all seen the example with whether the tools that companies promise are actually using AI and whether they do what they say they do. And there we're seeing some regulation coming in from, for example, securities regulators, right? If there is a company that's IPOing, what do you do with AI-specific products? So we're seeing some interest from securities regulators there.
We talk about this a lot with kind of our corporate governance and securities colleagues, but the importance of AI disclosures and not just being complacent with those, but really being hands-on, thinking through them, figuring out exactly the right balance of what you want to say. There's a lot of optimism. I think it kind of like drives that narrative sometimes to the importance of kind of making sure that all of those public statements are pressure tested. That is, feels like such an interesting and really, truly cross-jurisdictional point these days for companies. But I want to ask you a different kind of question to kind of close us out. What are you most personally excited about these days? I know you and I talk a lot about like technology. Where's the technology going? Like, what do you think is just the most compelling or interesting thing that's happening in AI from your perspective?
Yeah, we've spoken about AI a lot, you and I. I think I use it for everything. And I think just the ability to transform the industry that we are in, the legal industry, everything that we do, let's take arbitration, for example, right? It has the ability to transform research, drafting, document discovery, but it also comes with a lot of risk, ethical considerations and decision-making, for example. And I think I'm excited about navigating all of these novel issues. And I think it's important for us to be heavily involved in it because it takes you to a different, very important aspect of using AI, which is how do you train the next generation they're going to grow up with AI. And I don't think if we don't use it responsibly and figure out what the use cases are, it's going to be difficult to conduct training in a way that maintains critical thinking, ensures that junior associates are being able to exercise judgment sooner without having to do multiple cases and learn by doing. So I think these are some exciting issues that come up every day in our line of work.
Yeah, I was in our coffee lounge the other day and I overheard a junior associate say, one of the things I'm really getting better at is figuring out when to not use AI. Like what is too complex and like what is appropriate. And it's just fun. Like I think we're learning a lot from them. They're like in the weeds every day using these tools. So it's like an exciting time. We've got some mentoring, some reverse mentoring. So, it's a world in which I think we're kind of like navigating it all together and definitely having these conversations within our firm.
So maybe I can give you a little anecdote here. So I'm not going to name the tool, but I was playing a game with my 5-year-old son. We were trying to name a country with every alphabet. And we came to Y and we both looked at each other and I couldn't remember a country. And once we finished, we went back to an AI tool and said, hey, can you give me a country that starts with Y? And it said Yemen. Yeah, of course, I forgot Yemen. And then it said Yellowland. And it clearly hallucinated Yellowland. And I immediately realized, and I think it goes back to the training point that we discussed, right? Because if you know your countries, you know that Yellowland is not a country. But for a 5-year-old, my son now thinks Yellowland is a country. So I think there are very interesting issues that come up on how you train the younger generation in the use of AI. And that's just one example that I keep telling people. I'm sure you've heard it before, but it's fascinating to me.
That's awesome. Well, Rohit, thank you so much for joining us today. It was actually super fun because you were in our New York office today when we recorded this. And that's like such a rare gem for me, but I'll have to come out and see you in Singapore. And maybe we'll do a sequel to this. That's today's drop. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more of the AI Drop, hit subscribe and join us each week for fresh insights on what's shaping the future of AI. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and it does not constitute legal advice or establish an attorney-client relationship. It may be considered attorney advertising, so prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The views expressed here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of their firms, organizations, or clients. For more information, please visit freshfields.com.